the shining through of the divine. What is divinity? We may have a vision of a human being as instinctive because we have an animal body with the same instinctive nature as an animal. Survival and procreation are just as strong instincts in us as they are in cats, dogs, and rabbits. But there's also the divine. This is something that we rise up to or turn to because it's not instinctive. It won't be something we'll find unless we deliberately seek it. For reflection on divinity, we have the four Brahmaviharas, the beautiful, selfless qualities that can manifest through the human form when there's no self. When you're not caught in instinctive behavior or emotional reactions based on ignorance, when there's dispassion and the whole process of self-view ceases, divinity becomes obvious. Then kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and serenity of mind are not qualities we have to get, but qualities that manifest through these human forms. In our lives as separate individual beings, we relate to things. We have to meet and contact and react or respond to objects all the time throughout our lives. On the physical level, we have to respond to each other's presence in some way, by ignoring, embracing, paying respects, or cursing. In relationships, when there's no self, there's a divinity that manifests. Thus you can see that the human form is a form for the divine. On the other hand, we can think we live just for ourselves. It's my life, and I can do what I want. I have the right to happiness and all that kind of selfishness. If we don't rise above the animal mentality, we can live very much by following our instincts or emotions. Or we can live in a world of ideas, of attachment to ideas of how things should be, which is very much a problem in the Western world. But as you penetrate that, and see the suffering that comes from grasping anything at all, as that insight brings about letting go and non-attachment, there is a response to the way things are, which can be divided into these four categories of the Brahmaviharas. Metta, Karuna, Mudita, and Upekkha provide a reflection. They form a sequence of how to relate to the human realm, to the animal kingdom, and to nature. Metta is very much how we should relate to ourselves too. It's how to relate to ourselves with kindness and acceptance, rather than with aversion and judgment. Metta implies accepting something that may not be very nice, such as physical pain, or things that aren't very nice about your body or your character. Maybe you have a lot of fears or a bad temper, or something similar. If you have metta, that means you can accept those things for what they are. You're not judging them or condemning them from an ignorant, self-conscious position. You're aware of them as painful, unpleasant, or ugly. But metta practice is the ability to accept patiently the flaws, pain, irritations, and frustrations within our minds and bodies. Also the unpleasant and annoying things that impinge on them from outside. This is because with metta, such things are no longer seen as personal. There's no me and you. No, you've done this to me or I've done this to you. Metta is having perspective and not creating a problem even about unfairnesses, injustices, inadequacies, and so forth in ourselves, others, or society. This doesn't mean that we don't notice or can't see them, but it means we don't make problems about them. We don't carry them around in our minds with bitterness, resentment, anger, and destructive tendencies. With metta, there's always the ability to forgive and start anew, to recognize the way things are, and not expect everything to fit our ideals regarding how things should be. This doesn't mean that we fatalistically resign ourselves to mediocrity, tyranny, or stupidity, but that we aren't caught in the pattern of ignorance, conditioning mind formations. Thus we can bear with the vicissitudes of life with kindness and acceptance. Then there's Karuna, compassion. When we see the suffering of others and the injustices and unfairness that exist, we respond with compassion, but not like a wealthy person feeling sorry for the poor. That's not it. It's not looking down on the poor, not patronizing or feeling sorry for people, but understanding the predicament of our human condition and all that goes with it. It's from understanding the nature of suffering, how it arises and ceases, that you can have true Karuna for other beings. The British have a lot of Karuna for animals. Britain is quite an impressive country when you think how much wildlife there is in this densely populated area of southern England. That's a good quality Karuna. Britain is a kind country where people generally have developed compassion, concern for the unfortunate and the underprivileged. When we moved to Chithurst, there were people who didn't want us there, but most of the local people tried to be fair. In other words, they had a certain measure of compassion for us. They wouldn't have harmed us or tried to get rid of us, even though they may have preferred a nice Christian monastery or a nice, proper upper-class family to buy Chithurst House, a family who would keep horses and play polo. That would have been more in line with the general mood of West Sussex because people like what they're used to. But because Metta Karuna were already developed, only a few people were directly hostile or wanted to take action against us. So one can regard this as Metta Karuna. Sometimes in Theravada Buddhism, one gets the impression that one shouldn't enjoy beauty. If you see a beautiful flower, you should contemplate its decay, or if you see a beautiful woman, you should contemplate her as a rotting corpse. This has a certain value on one level, but it's not a fixed position to take. It's not that we should feel compelled to reject beauty and dwell on its impermanence and on how it changes on being not so beautiful and then downright repulsive. That's a good reflection on anicca, dukkha, and anatta, but it can leave the impression that beauty is only to be reflected on in terms of these three characteristics, rather than in terms of the experience of beauty. This is the joy of mudita, being able to appreciate the beauty in the things around us. Flowers are a lot prettier than we are. We admit they're prettier. We expect them to be, and we don't envy them their beauty. But we might really hate somebody else for being beautiful, because then it's a threat. Somebody else's beauty makes me look not so beautiful. This is to be observed, not to try to force a kind of false happiness onto the situation, but to let these things cease in your mind. To be clearly aware of this particular problem is to stay with it and not make a problem about it from the self-view. Recognize it as anicca, dukkha, anatta. Let it cease. Let go of it. Then, in that letting go, we find a rejoicing in the talents, the goodness and the beauty of other beings. When you look at flowers, you experience a joyful feeling, and that's mudita. You're rejoicing in or glad at the beauty of something. Maybe you've never reflected like that. We see beautiful things in nature, and because they're no threat to us or anything else, we can rejoice in the sunset or the beauty of trees and mountains and rivers. So that's mudita, a rejoicing in beauty, goodness, and truth. And we rejoice in the goodness of others. When somebody does something good or you hear about some noble action, heroic effort, or self-sacrifice, a sense of mudita arises. That's joy, sympathetic joy. But we tend to fall short of this when it becomes a matter of you and me. We can be very jealous of somebody's health and beauty if we're caught in the self-view. We might feel joy at the flowers in the garden, but then go to a neighbor's house where the flowers are more beautiful than ours. We might feel envy because from a self position it's her flowers look better than mine and she's more beautiful than I am, or he's better looking than I am, or he's more intelligent, or he has a better personality. So we suffer from envy and jealousy. It's a very common problem. In fact, many human beings are really stuck in envy and jealousy. If one were to go to a rich person's house with beautiful grounds, a swimming pool, beautiful oriental carpets, and lovely furnishings, a selfless person might rejoice at being in a beautiful place. Or one might think, wealthy people probably got rich from cheating the poor and ripping off the underprivileged. Grumble, grumble, grumble. I remember once going into a beautiful church in London with somebody. I said, "Oh, what a lovely church." He said, "Yeah, it was probably at the expense of all those colonies the British exploited." But I wasn't commenting on history, but experiencing the gladness of being in a beautiful place. And yet we can think that maybe that church was built out of the slave trade or the opium trade. Perhaps slave traders and drug traffickers centuries ago felt guilty, so they built a magnificent church in London. But that doesn't mean that it's not beautiful. We're not judging it on a moral plane, but reflecting on the joy, on the experience of beauty, goodness, and truth. These are what bring joy into our lives. People who can't see the beauty of the good or the true are really bitter and mean at heart. They live in an ugly realm where there's no rejoicing in beauty, goodness, and truth. To rejoice in these things doesn't mean that we get carried away with them. The experience of joy no longer occurs if we indulge in beauty and try to grasp it, or if we hold on to the experience of joy to try to have it all the time. But mudita is certainly a part of our human experience. Mudita is our ability to be joyful with the beauty and loveliness of life's experiences. It's the sense of joy and appreciation and gratitude for the beauties and the lovely things of life, the lovely things in other people. So when there's no self, then there's joy. We find joy in the goodness, the beauty of the people around us or in society or natural conditions. Once you have insight, you find you enjoy, delight in the beauty and the goodness of things. Truth, beauty, and goodness delight us. In them we find joy. That's mudita. But if you see beauty as something to grasp, it arouses desire. You see beautiful human beings, a beautiful woman or man, and you think, I want. That's desire. It's not rejoicing in the beauty of someone. It's the desire to possess, control, and get something for yourself out of it. At the level of instinct, that's the way it is. It's natural enough. If we didn't find each other attractive, no one would want to perpetuate the species. If sexual activities were painful and miserable, nobody would want to do them. And if we found each other totally repulsive and ugly, we wouldn't want to get close to each other, not to mention anything as intimate as sex. Desire is the natural way on that level of the sensory realm. There's nothing wrong with it. But there's the possibility for a human being to transcend it. If desire was all we were and all we could do, we should always follow it. But because we can transcend it, we have this connection to the divine. We can rise above the coarse, instinctive nature of our own bodies in the animal realm. And that's what I'm pointing to. I'm not condemning the animal realm. Animals can bring us a lot of joy. Down at Chithurst recently, I spent the day with Doris, our cat, and I've always felt she brought me a lot of joy. She's a very pleasant animal. If I got attached to her, however, I'd say, I've got to have Doris. I've got to bring Doris here to Amaravati. I can't live without her. Then I'd drag her up here, and she would have to fight with the cats who live here, and it would all be just for me, just so I could get what I wanted. That wouldn't be a joyful experience anymore, and it would cause a lot of problems. We can reflect on how things affect us. Always to want mudita, the beautiful flowers, the waterfalls, and the beautiful birds singing, means that you can't rejoice in them anymore because you're trying to hold on. You're trapped in all kinds of views and opinions about them, so that even if you're in the midst of them, you're not really enjoying them, rejoicing in them anymore, because you've been separated from them through your desire for them. In our life as samanas, contemplating nature, contemplating the Dhamma, we don't have to think that all beauty is just there to corrupt us and give us another rebirth. That's another self-view. But be aware of how beauty affects you. When you see a beautiful woman or a handsome man, how does that affect your mind? There may be an initial attraction, and then you can easily start to feel threatened and reject the person because we have a life of celibacy. Or you might give a second glance and dally with the sexual thoughts that might arise from that eye contact. But the more you're mindful, the less you tend to follow things such as desire. The less you tend to create or add to the feelings with desire and attachment. When you're mindful, you don't do that. Enlightenment doesn't mean a kind of bland indifference. Sometimes enlightenment is made to sound as if it means something emotionless, becoming emotionless zombies. People who don't feel anything anymore. Well, as long as there's a self, what we would call joy tends to be tinged with selfishness. It becomes stained with ourselves. We become jealous if we have something beautiful and somebody else has something more beautiful, because selfishness always turns beauty into possessiveness. If the beauties of life, the joy of truth and beauty and goodness are coming from self, they're always corrupted with jealousy, envy, and begrudging people. So if there's selfishness, even being the most beautiful of all is not really a joyful experience, because you're always worried that someone else might claim that crown. If you adopt a self-view, there's always that possibility. But when there's no self, beauty doesn't belong to anyone. It's not mine or yours. We realize there's no possibility of possessing it anyway, so there's no desire to possess. So there can be the joy of the experience of beauty without it being corrupted by selfishness. Then Upekkha, equanimity, serenity. To be able to abide in serenity of the mind. We're not going around looking for beautiful things to find delight in, because there's no self. You respond to beauty with joy, but it's not something that you look for or seek as a person anymore. So the ordinariness of life is Upekkha, is serenity. It's about having peacefulness with the pains and aches of the aging process and separation from the loved. All this is the realization of Upekkha, of serenity. Upekkha doesn't mean indifference. Sometimes it's translated as indifference, but it actually means serenity when things are ugly, unpleasant, or ordinary. If you follow the Asubha practices, noticing, paying attention to the unbeautiful, the not beautiful, you begin to create Upekkha, equanimity or serenity. There was a hospital in Bangkok which received all the murder victims and violent deaths, corpses found in the canals and things like that. If you went in on a Monday, they would have a collection from the weekend, a variety of gruesome, macabre objects that would first give you a strong feeling of revulsion. You'd go in and say, "Yuck, let me get out of here." Because we don't generally like to look at human bodies that have been butchered and mangled and are in a state of decay. Such things are what civilized society always keeps away from. We have institutions to take care of them, so they never have to meet our attention. But if one meditates on these things, the result is actually equanimity or serenity. If you get over the initial aversion, horror, and negativity towards a rotting human corpse or a human corpse that's been cut up in an autopsy, the result is equanimity, a tremendous peacefulness and serenity. Not depression, not aversion. When there's no self, one can abide in a state of serenity. If there's a self, then we say, "I hate it, I don't like it, take it away. I can't stand it, I can't bear this, it's foul, it's disgusting." But when there's equanimity, actually, there's no self. So one's not making problems about the process of living and the way things move and change and go from beauty to decay. With mudita, you find joy in the beauty, and when the beauty fades, there's equanimity rather than sorrow. Upekkha is actually the ability not to follow aversion or be carried away when you see beautiful things. So we're not just running around trying to rejoice in beauty or trying to feel Karuna for every unfortunate creature. We can let ourselves wait when there's nothing much happening. With Upekkha, one doesn't have to seek something to become happy about or some cause to fight for, or engage in the compulsive activity that's another great problem for modern humanity. We try to use up our need for restless activity and good causes, instead of being always involved in activities because there's no Upekkha. Traditionally, the Brahmaviharas are considered as Lokya Dhammas, mundane Dhamma, not the transcendent or Lokuttara Dhamma. Because of the way the mind tends to think, the view arises that they're not worth bothering with. Lokuttara Dhamma are the important ones. You don't pay attention to Lokya Dhammas. But with mindfulness, you're with the relationship of the Lokya to the Lokuttara Dhamma. We relate on the Lokya Dhamma level through the Brahmaviharas, Metta, Karuna, Mudita, and Upekkha. When there's no self, when there's no ignorance conditioning the mental formations, then there's the way of things, the Lokya Dhammas. But we're not asking Mudita to be a permanent experience. We're not expecting to have a continuous, absolute, eternal experience of rejoicing and joy in our lives, because we're not attached to that as a viewpoint. So the Brahmaviharas represent a spontaneous response to the experience of birth and consciousness when there's no self. They're a spontaneous response from selflessness, from anatta, rather than an impulsive reaction from desire. There's a difference between a spontaneous response to wisdom and mindfulness and an impulsive reaction to desire. The difference lies in that view of a self. In the self-view, one is still grasping, just reacting impulsively with desire to life's impingements and experiences. When there's no more ignorance, there's spontaneity. That's what spontaneity is. There's no self in it. It's just a more and more natural way to respond to beauty, truth, and virtue, or to pain and misery, or to winter, spring, summer, and autumn, to the fortunate beings or the unfortunate ones, and even to the waiting, holding your cup of tea, looking out the window at the rain. This is just a contemplation of what divinity is. If you reflect on the instinctive nature, the earthbound body, its sexual desires, its reproductive abilities, survival, eating, drinking, sleeping, all these basic instinctive necessities. There's nothing bad about them. They're just the way a form like this survives. It has to reproduce itself. In fact, human beings are becoming too good at reproducing themselves. It's rather frightening. How many billions is the world population? 6 billion and rising on the planet? And if they were all just like animals, just operating out of instinct, they would be several billion selfish, undeveloped, neurotic, screwed up human beings. It's terribly frightening. Or take it to the opposite extreme. Several billion enlightened human beings. Now that might not be so bad. Several billion enlightened human beings, rather than several billion ignorant, selfish human beings. Several billion human beings who can manifest the divine in their daily lives through Metta, Karuna, Mudita, Upekkha. That doesn't sound so bad. It sounds rather nice. But several billion human beings manifesting greed, hatred, and delusion is a pretty grim picture. Yet we don't have the right to comment on them. This one here, this is what we have. This is what we can work on. Don't worry about the others. This is what you can develop through reflection and through meditation.